I go to, 15, 20 seminars like this every year, and I hear the same things often over and over, and every time I learn something because it reinforces something that I knew but maybe forgot to apply. It reminds me to slow down and say, wait a minute, this does work, and so I need to pay more attention to it. And I also just have to trust that you all will take the parts of this week and the 3 weeks after this and use what works for you, park the other stuff somewhere in your brain pan, and then when you need it, use that. I really do hope, though, that you challenge yourself to stretch and say, even if we haven't done things a certain way, what if we tried? What would happen? Anytime I work with journalists who resist doing something a different way because our worlds are geared to, especially since we work so fast. Hi. Our worlds are geared to doing the thing we've always done because it's what we can do efficiently and it's safe. And one of the things I do when I talk to reporters about taking a risk and doing something more creative, you liked that story we looked at the other day because it had a creative approach, is to say, what if you tried something different with a story? And if it doesn't work, you can always go back and do the story the same way you've always done it because you know how to do that and you can do that fast. And in the U.S., what we've learned over the years is that the traditional way we do stories doesn't work as well for readers because they forget them. They kind of collect the information, but it doesn't stay with them. The stories aren't memorable. And so the more you can make your stories memorable, the more you can tell a story that a person connects with emotionally, the more you have impact. And that's what this is all about, is getting people to remember this stuff and to understand why it has meaning. Okay? So please keep challenging us. Ask questions. Make this. We got 3 more days this week. Be as selfish as you can about learning. I don't have to agree with you. You don't have to agree with me. But learn as much as you can. We're going to start. I'm going to show you a little video clip. I want to show it to you because it's just a really interesting example of a story that grabs people emotionally. And there's some lessons buried in it about sourcing and about interviewing. And the truth is, underlying this story, you could find an economic story. Remember on Monday we were talking and I said that the world I grew up in, politics and government, were the things you really had to, they were what ran the world. When Nixon went to China, that was huge, right? President of the United States goes to China for the first time. Reagan, huge influence on the world. Reagan started shifting things and the world started shifting to business and finance. Underlying almost every story, you could find a money story. And I really want to encourage you this morning, we're going to think about how to put some humanity in stories. We're going to talk about interview strategies overall, but I also want to talk about sourcing stories at a level that starts putting humanity in them. So let's see if I can make this work.
Westmoreland County. Here we go. The toughest part about picking people at random and telling their stories is that most people have no idea what their story is. Is it?
Sometimes I think I'm boring, and sometimes I think I'm a nobody, and what could anybody be interested in my life?
Well, just give me a minute. Susie Izat lives with her husband Jim and their 3 strong helpers, Joey, Dennis, and Josh.
Wow.
Their family is a Norman Rockwell painting come to life.
There it is.
And yet, time was when Susie couldn't have dreamed of a Christmas like this.
Okay, ready, go, and don't mind that over.
I had a hysterectomy on my 25th birthday, actually.
25th?
25th birthday. Yeah.
Susie and Jim adopted Josh 5 years later, but decided not to adopt again because the waiting list was so long, choosing instead to become foster parents.
Can you put into words why you like it here so much? Because they love us and they snuggle us.
They snuggle you.
And he's a snuggle bug.
We fell in love with these kids, and I think it's obvious why we did it.
The two brothers used to live here in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, an old depressed steel mill town. They first went into foster care about 3 years ago because of neglect. And Susie says when she first met them, they had almost animal-like behavior. They would claw at people. They weren't properly toilet trained. And they didn't know how to use silverware.
They have come incredibly far.
Not only do they now know how to use silverware,
That was good night.
chopsticks,
Yes.
you know how to use those?
Yes.
The boys have scrapbooks full of their new adventures.
This is my first tree that I climbed in my life. I love this page.
Obviously, even though the boys don't officially belong to this family, Susie and Jim have tried to make them feel a part of it. Which is why Joey and Dennis say they have just one last favor to ask of the Isaacs.
Can I be adopted?
Is that your one wish?
Yes.
When Susie first found out she couldn't have kids, she told herself God must have a better plan. Now, 15 years later, she says she knows what it is.
The love that we have in our family is more than I ever want. It's so fulfilling. It's so good.
Pass this over to Joe. Pass it to me.
So, Joey, to answer your question, yes, you will both be adopted, just as soon as the judge signs the papers.
Like that one?
And that's the story of the boring woman from Pennsylvania, who thinks she's a nobody, with absolutely nothing interesting going on in her life. Steve Hartman, CBS News.
The tax money that it costs to care for these kids if they're left to the state system, right? Excellent points to project what happens when kids like this grow up without a family system. You could flip it around and make the story, focus the story on what it costs to raise children these days. Steve Hartman he developed a reputation in the U.S. He worked for CBS News, and he did a series of pieces for about 5 years called Everybody Has a Story. And this is what he'd do, literally. He and his boss would stand in their newsroom, had a map of the United States. Remember maps? They'd throw a dart at the map, and wherever it landed, Steve and his photographer that he worked with, the partner he worked with, a guy named Ted Rose, one of the best video journalists in the U.S. today. Big guy, 6'7". How translate that to your language? 6'7", right? Tall, big guy. There you go. Whatever. He's big. I'm told he's one of the best interviewers in the U.S. And he has all kinds of techniques he uses to get people to talk to him, including when he talks to kids, he gets down on his knees because he wants to meet them at their level. It's hard to interview children. They're afraid of you. You're an authority figure. So are adults a lot of times. They go around and they throw this dart at the map, and they go to the town where the dart lands, and they go to a payphone, if they can still find one, and they open a phone book, they open a page, and they stick their finger there, and they show up, and they do a story. And I heard an interview once with Steve Hartman when he said in the 5 years they were doing this, they used to do a piece every week, only twice did people turn them down. Did they not find a story? And I like this clip because, it's very sweet. You can look at it and just say, well, that was nice, but it doesn't mean anything. But it proves a few things. One is it proves that everybody does indeed have a story, and that you can, if you apply the right professional and human instincts, get people to tell you their story. Now let's switch back a little bit and talk about meaning. So you guys identified the potential economic and financial stories. I've watched this clip probably 50 times, and every time I watch it, I see something new. And one of the things I'm always astonished about is that moment at the beginning where She says, I had a hysterectomy on my 25th birthday. And the reporter, Steve Hartman, goes, 25? And she goes, yeah, that's really personal, right? Ladies, do you run around and tell the world about, your reproductive systems? Probably not. And yet, for me, that makes the story. Because it's this woman being vulnerable and saying something went wrong in my life. And then it's the gray area, right? And we need to go there because that's where people live. Even with economics and business. Now, I'm not suggesting you do this with every story you write. Some stories just need to be numbers. They need, when the stock market crashes in the US, people want the number. But then I want the stories that help me understand how people are dealing with that number. What happens when somebody my age, who spent their entire life working hard, saving money, doing everything you were told to do, buy a house, invest in property, go to college, get a job, suddenly has no money for retirement. So when I read that story, suddenly, 1, I feel less alone. 2, I understand that other people are managing to find solutions, and maybe I need to. 3, I get a little perspective to say, well, quit your own little pity party here. 4, I'm like, we're all in this together, so why doesn't government and society figure it out? And it helps make that number real. Because the only thing about these numbers are abstractions. You know that term abstraction? They're nothing, right? They're just a bunch of figures we made up. It's what the numbers do to people. Businesses, in some ways, businesses don't matter at all, except they make money, and that money helps people live. It's all about people. And so one of the things to think about when you're going out and doing this kind of work is, where do you find the people that can help make your stories real? And I'm really interested in this notion that the pressure you feel, apparently, to not do good stories, positive stories, hopeful stories. Everybody criticizes us, and when I drill down, my sense is that people criticizing you are other journalists. You're not doing it for them. You're not doing it for them. I'll tell you a quick story. I have a dear, dear, dear friend. I went to college with him. He's one of the best writers in the United States. His name is Charlie Pierce. And he covered sports for a long time. He now is the political blogger for Esquire.com. He's on the radio. He's a genius. He's just a genius. And a big personality. He's a quirky guy. And back in the day when he was covering sports, and he worked for Sports Illustrated. He did national sports. Tiger Woods, the golfer, you guys all know who Tiger Woods is, right? Let's go have a fight with our wife and then admit to the world we're a sex addict. Tiger Woods was rising as a new young star, and everybody was in love with Tiger Woods, right? He's gorgeous. He's very, very skilled. He's multiracial. He's biracial. He's like everybody's favorite poster boy for the new American athlete. All these journalists are covering him. And my friend Charlie, this was years ago, my friend Charlie did a story about Tiger Woods' tendency towards racism. Tiger Woods would tell terribly racist jokes out on the circuit. Nobody wrote about it. Charlie wrote about it. Charlie wrote that Tiger Woods has a dark side. Everybody's golden boy, half black, half Japanese, tells racist jokes, makes fun of people of color. Wow. Charlie wrote it, and he was blackballed. Do you know that term? Blackballed, banned, shunned, criticized by other journalists. For years, the club that was sports reporters in the United States would have nothing to do with Charlie, because they knew the same thing Charlie knew, but they didn't write it because they were protecting the club, that they were protecting their own notions of what a journalist is supposed to be. It's really common in the U.S. for sports reporters not to write about a lot of the things they know about in sports. Football players in the U.S., I told you I covered sports for a while. I covered the Olympics and stuff. And I covered pro football, our version of football, American football, not your football, soccer. The world's football is soccer. America's football is football. It was absolutely well known among journalists in the U.S. who covered sports that football players took steroids and had a notorious habit of having wild sex parties with groupies, young women who would hang out at practices. I went down to one of the training camps one time for the Minnesota Vikings, which was our football team in Minnesota. And before the season begins, they go to a college campus and they train. And they have a trailer, and the guys are training, and you'd watch a line of young women standing outside the trailer going in with pro athletes. I'd go in the locker room, because women had finally fought their way into the locker room. The harassment that these football players gave women was amazing. Nobody wrote about it. Nobody in the press wrote about the fact that President John F. Kennedy had multiple affairs. And it wasn't because the public was telling us they didn't want that. It was because the club of journalists was saying, oh, no, don't go there, because then we won't be in the club. So Charlie was blackballed by other journalists. 15, 20 years later, it's revealed that Tiger Woods has some real serious problems. Charlie was the only one who was willing to write about it at first. Charlie was right, and he did the right thing. Because maybe if somebody had written about Tiger Woods early on and said, Tiger Woods is not the perfect guy you think he is, something different might have happened. Now, is it Charlie's job to psychoanalyze Tiger Woods? No. But if Tiger Woods is making bazillions of dollars because people all over are paying him for endorsements, little kids all over the world are saying, I want to grow up and be Tiger Woods, and we don't tell people the rest of the story, the real story, we're lying to people. So I just want to urge you to not take the criticism of your colleagues over the interests of the public. If I was going to go to McDonald's, I'd be very careful not to write a story that was just based on what McDonald's wanted me to say. But would I use that to crack open the door and say, I'm going to do some quick research and find out how much money McDonald's makes in the Ukraine, how many people go and eat at McDonald's? I'm probably going to find a lot of them do. I was walking with our friend Brian Bonner the other day, and we were walking along the river, because I told you I still want to figure out what the hell's happening with the construction on the river. Before I leave on Sunday, I'm going to know what's happening on the river. And there was this whole lineup of people. I wanted to get to that pedestrian bridge and walk across the bridge, and we couldn't figure out how to get there, because Brian's kind of stupid when it comes to geography. And so we were trying, I said, well, there's a hole in the fence here, right? There's an opening in the fence, and maybe there's a bunch of people going. There's this whole line of people going through the fence. I said, well, maybe that goes to the bridge. And we walk up, it was a line of people going to McDonald's. That means there's interest in that story. And if I go to McDonald's or take my kids to McDonald's, I want to read how McDonald's processes its meat. I'm going to report it further. I'm not just going to take McDonald's word for it. But ultimately, your reporting needs to be sound, and you've got to tell people the whole picture. The one last thing I want to say about this, and then I want Christian to talk a little bit about his experience in Romania, because he deals with this much more in the same way you guys do. There was a study recently in the U.S. Let me start this a little differently. In the U.S., the press is criticized for only telling bad news. So you guys are saying you get criticized if you tell good news. We are criticized because the public believes all we do is tell them bad news. Now, it's not true, but that's the perception. that all we do is go after scandal, go after corruption. And it's one of the reasons people have stopped reading us. There were 2 studies that I found interesting. One recently was an actual scientific study about the effect on people of reading constant bad news. War in Iraq, the number of people killed, 27 kids shot in a school, first graders in Newtown, Massachusetts, 15 people shot in a theater one night watching the latest Batman movie or whatever it was. Murder, mayhem, gangs, drugs, wars. The economy sucks, blah, blah, blah. Now, if you pick up any newspaper or any TV, watch any broadcast any day of the week, TV's a bit of an exception because TV does sell bad news in the U.S. You will find a lot of good news, but people don't tend to notice it. Interesting study that showed that if people get too much negative, bad, depressing news, they literally they reach a saturation point. They get overfilled, and their brains turn off. They can't absorb it. So their body has this natural defense mechanism that says, I can't take in anymore. And it makes them literally depressed. And so they stop watching. They stop reading. They start seeing everything in terms of bad news, and their system reacts to it so badly that it protects them and they won't go there. And it's one of the reasons I think we have trouble getting people to attach to us. The other thing I saw recently, because I don't know, is Facebook a really big deal here? Yeah? Yeah, okay. The whole internet has just become a fascinating phenomenon. One of the things that started where I was watching this a few years ago was the rise of something in the U.S. called Caring Bridge, caringbridge.org. And it's a site that grew up as a little membership site. It's free. And what people do is if they're sick, they have a relative who's sick, or they're sick, they're in the hospital. Started, I think, cancer patients. They go on to caringbridge.org and they write their story. They blog their story. And they write about what's going on with them. And I'm thinking, yuck. It is immensely popular because people have found a community of support and they follow other people, and it has more followers than a lot of news organizations because people want to read these stories of struggle and survival, of people who are going through the things that they might be going through. And so the public has found a way to go around the press and find its own way to tell stories that matter to them. And there was a piece recently that was a study of the stories that go viral on Facebook. And the common denominator in the stories that go viral were this sense of triumph over struggle. Stories about people who had faced some kind of adversity and come through it. Stories about dogs and cats, too, in the U.S., at least. People love animal stories in the U.S. for some reason. But it's really interesting for us to think about that and say, well, what do we do about that? And I'm not saying that means we suddenly all turn into tabloid magazines that are doing, sob sister stories. Do you know that term, sob sisters? Sob sister was a term in the U.S. in journalism in about the 1920s for emotional stories, right? The dramatic story of the little girl with cancer who, fights to the end and then dies, right? We called them sob sister stories. I'm not saying that's all we should do. I think the lesson in here for us is to find the humanity in stories whenever it's appropriate, because that's what people attach to. Abortion becomes a litmus test, a test for whether or not somebody's going to get elected or not. And people say extreme things about abortion when the truth is 73% of Americans or something actually are kind of moderate on abortion. They don't like it, but they think some of it's necessary. And so you've got a bunch of politicians and extremists who say we have to ban all abortion, it's genocide, it's the new Holocaust. And there was this famous case a few months back, where a politician from Missouri, where I teach, said in public that it was an anti-abortion speech, and it was about trying to ban abortions even in the case of rape or incest. And he said that the body, a woman's body, has a natural way to not get pregnant if she's raped. This guy's an elected official. I mean, whew, the public just doesn't buy this stuff. So there's no trust in government. And the trouble is, and this is the part that's interesting, they lump us in with government, but they also think that the press is biased toward a liberal agenda. And so the trust in the media is also at an all-time low. And yet, when big things happen, they come back to us because they know that if they come to the New York Times or they come to CNN or they come to their local newspaper, we're still the ones out getting the information right. So it's a really difficult relationship right now. I think we've got to be really, really smart about marketing ourselves better, letting people know what we do and why we do it. We've never been good about telling our story. Aggressively letting people know every day that we're on their side, letting them know how we do that work. So I'm wondering if one of the things for you guys to wrestle with and work at is, instead of not doing the story that people are going to think maybe you got paid for, to do that story and tell people why you did that story and how you did that story. One of the things that readers in the U.S. have demonstrated they love is when the press actually gives them a related story that tells them how they did the story that they did, including gives them access to the documents, the raw materials. People love it. They love it. So we now often link to records. If we get records from something, we let the public have those records too. Doing a breakdown of how, so there's a convention now, a practice in the U.S. where there will be stories attached to stories that literally say how I did this story. Interviewed 13 people, looked at these records, had to file a Freedom of Information request, spent 15 hours with whoever. People love it. It's this really interesting thing, and I think if we do more of that, it'll help us. I'm sorry, I'm wandering. I mentioned this reporter friend of mine. She's a police reporter, and police reporting is a very difficult thing to do in the U.S. We have a high crime rate. The police don't trust us at all. Terribly antagonistic relationship between the police and the press. This friend of mine who's been covering police for 35 years, best police reporter I know, she has total access to the police. She can get access to the police that I've never seen any other reporter get. And one day I had her in to talk to a class of mine. I said, Caroline, why do the police talk to you when they won't talk to anybody else? And she said, because I made a deal with the police early on that I would tell the whole story, which means I tell the good stories too about the police. She went through training with them. She literally went through the police academy. So she understood what it took to be trained to be a police officer. She carries a gun. She knows how to use it. She doesn't, but she knows how. When she shows up on a scene, she understands what they're going through, which means she's not getting in their way. She understands their job. And she makes sure that she covers the part of the police department that is positive, because the police do a lot of service work in the U.S. Often police forces will do work volunteering with homeless kids. You know, they'll run little baseball teams and stuff for kids. She writes about that and puts that on the air too. And I said, well, but you have this access that allows you to do those stories. She said, you know, I did this thing that I got criticized for years ago when I was having trouble doing my job. I went to the police and I said, I will spend 6 months finding all the good things you do, and after 6 months you tell me that I don't care. So she went overboard for a while to find out those good stories and prove to them she was sincere, and then she was able to go back to them and said, and I have to write everything about you. I have to write the good and the bad. And that's the deal. So it takes a while. It's all about this establishing trust with sources and eventually and it's better journalism, frankly. the U.S. gets criticized, the press in the U.S. gets criticized a lot for how we cover the war. And on one hand, I don't think we cover it enough. I mean, we're out killing people and having Americans killed. We should be writing about it every day. On the other hand, people think all we do is write about that we're too critical of the military. If you look at the New York Times any day of the week and count, we write a lot about what the U.S. military is trying to do in Iraq and Afghanistan that are good. The doctors who go there and save children, the people who are building schools. But the public doesn't notice it because we don't do enough of it. You've got to have that balance or nobody's going to trust you. Got to have that balance. I want to show one other example here of a story that is, zoom in. Is this big enough? Is the type big enough in the back? Can you see? No? Hello? Yes? No? Better? Yeah? Okay. Do you have postal delivery here? Home delivery of the mail? Okay. Is it in trouble? No? In the United States, the United States Postal Service is one of the original institutions in the U.S. It started with the Pony Express back in when the U.S. was expanding to the west and people were living far, far away, and somebody created a system where people would get on a horse and, ride and deliver your mail. And it was the way America stayed connected. Frankly, it was the way newspapers got delivered. It was Pony Express. The U.S. Postal Service is an interesting organization because it's quasi-government and quasi-private. So it's subsidized by the government, but it's not a government agency. It's supposed to make its own money. Well, in the era of the Internet, as you can imagine, the Postal Service is in trouble. And a lot of people complain about the post office because their mail gets delivered slow or it's late or people lose things or whatever. It's an amazing institution, but it's in a lot of trouble. And there have actually been threats that the Postal Service is going to be folded. And we're just going to go to private delivery services. DHL, you probably have DHL here, Federal Express, things like that. And it's this interesting institution that people have a real close attachment to. And yet they complain about it all the time. Now, I mail a letter, and it goes anywhere in the United States in about 2 days, and it costs me 47 cents. Why anybody would complain about that, I don't know. But I could do the same thing by email, right, for free. Except email's a little different. Post office is in trouble, and post offices around the country are being closed because they're trying to save money. So it's a huge economic story. How much do we subsidize the Postal Service? And there's a strong economic story attached, too, because if you live or work out in a rural area, if you have a business out in the country and your post office closes, you suddenly, the cost of your business goes way up because you no longer get things delivered. My non-husband husband, my other half, my partner of many, many, many years, owns a small newspaper. He's an entrepreneur now. He owns a small newspaper out in the mountains, about 5 hours from Seattle. They are absolutely dependent on the post office to do their business. And the post office, because the newspaper mostly gets mailed to people. You can buy it there, but half of their subscriptions go out by mail. And they get all of their supplies and their equipment, right, by mail. And there's talk of them closing the post office in the town where his newspaper is headquartered, which means the next nearest post office would be 3 hours away. The implications for him are huge. He puts out a weekly newspaper. They would have to change their deadline production schedule if the post office closed in their town because the newspaper would be a full day late, and suddenly everybody who works for him would have to change their shifts and work on the weekend in order to get the paper to people by Wednesday because it would take that long for the post office to deliver. So it's a huge story. Well, a reporter who I work with at the Missourian was really fascinated with this, and she wanted to go write about it. But it's a very complex piece. So I said, the post office has been written about and written about and written about. And, I mean, I could go through and find 500 stories in here. And Columbia is not a big city. It's 100,000 people about the post office, and nobody's paying attention. And she says, but I love mail carriers. She blinked. She's really cute. I said, well, give it your best shot. She went and found Jeff Connell. Jeff Connell knows the name of nearly every resident in the 65203 zip code. He knows the worn wooden porch with the wide awning on Spring Valley Road is home to 2 children and twice as many bikes. He knows the owner of the adult video store on Walnut Street loves Canon cameras. He knows what time residents of Crestmere Avenue slide up their automatic garage doors and leave for work. He's even been known to recognize lost dogs and deliver them to their own yards. Don't you love Jeff Connell? The residents know him too. They know peanut butter cookies are his favorite. They know the birthday of his 17-year-old daughter, Danielle. They call him Monkey Man because of the tattoo on his left shoulder. The familiarity is built on thousands of visits, week after week, year after year. For almost 3 decades, Connell, 48, has delivered 3,000 to 4,000 pieces of mail each day to local businesses, houses, and apartment buildings. So what? Here's so what. Despite massive technological upheaval and financial chaos that threaten the future of the U.S. Postal Service, Connell's routine has remained largely unaffected. So now she's got a story about huge economic disruption in the U.S., but what she's done is she's told it through one guy who all these people relate to, and when I read that story, I suddenly am thinking about the guy who brings me my mail. And he's bringing me my mail for 15 years. I don't know his name, but I love it when he shows up. I leave him cookies at Christmas. If I'm on my front porch, he hands me my mail personally. That's my mail. That's the post office to me. It's not all these other people. It's my version of Jeff Connell. And look at what she does with this. This is a 20-year-old, by the way, who wrote this. She's back to Connell. He uses the same mail bag he carried on his first day on the job 28 years ago, the navy cloth now strained and gaping with holes. His routes have expanded but stayed consistent enough that he has watched children grow from their birth announcements to high school graduation invitations. This is his connection with them. He's delivering all this stuff, right? We are part of the community, he said. It's what we do. When I adopted my daughter, I took a week off. When I came back, there were presents, like tiny for the mailman. Nice, huh? And then she goes into the business part of it. Mails funnels through the giant processing center. Here's how many things it delivers. More than 100,000 letters. Connell's and other ones like him are called one-touch workers. She's talking about how the Postal Service works. She goes on. She's telling me a little bit of how it works. Now she's telling me about the history of the post office, how it came to be. I'm learning a lot here. I didn't know this. I did not know that you could mail all this stuff. She's telling me how the post office, remember I said yesterday people don't know how their worlds work? I didn't know all this stuff. And then she gets into what the story's really about, which is hiring freezes, cutbacks in hours, budgets going crazy. I wouldn't have read any of this if I hadn't started with Jeff Connell delivering his mail, because now it's become a personal story for me. I can relate to it. So on this list here, one of the things you guys talked about was reader interest. And reader interest is all about relatability. And the more you can get people to relate to a story through the human aspect, the more you're going to get them to understand the rest of it. So one of the things to think about is, how do you find those people? How do you get the Jeff Connell of the world? How does she get to know these things? There are 3 levels. I break sources into 3 levels. One are officials. And I'm going to ask Christian to jump in here too, because he said some interesting things about this. Official or public sources, right? These are the people that mostly I've heard you talking about. This has to do with who you think of as sources, but also how you talk to sources, how you get access. Mostly, we go to public or institutional officials for our information, right? And you guys have talked a lot about the problems you have with these folks, how difficult it is to get some of them to talk. Maybe you don't trust them. In business, it's the company officials. It's The public relations people I would put in this category. The difficulty here is they've all got an agenda. They've all got spin. And so getting access to them is its own challenge, but also trusting what they tell you is difficult. Our relationship with these people is tricky and sometimes adversarial. These are the people we usually go to for information. But it's a very limited pool. And I want to show you two other groups that are, because again, part of this is thinking about how you're going to tell a story, and then part of it is ethics. Ethics in interviewing and sourcing are very, very important. And they're important for your relationship with that source, but they're also crucial for how the public perceives us. You neither want to be seen as being in bed with these people, nor do you want to be seen as constantly antagonistic, which means our relationship with these people needs to be one of professional equals. They have a role and a job, and their job in theory is to serve the public, or to, and even if you're a businessman and your job is to make money, most business people would argue that they're doing it because they're providing a service or a product that's for the public, right? Blah, blah, bullshit. I'm waiting for Delta Airlines to do something that feels like they're serving me, the public, because mostly it feels like they just screw me over all the time. But they'll say that, they get on, if you're on an airplane, the CEO of Delta Airlines has this wonderful speech where he says, our job is to take care of you. I'm like, then why are you so nasty? It's really funny, but that's what they say. And our job is also to serve the public, which means we can't apologize for what we do, and we have to stand up with these people one-to-one, and when they push back, we need to also push back. You've got to own sort of the power and the purpose of what it means to be a journalist. So if the police chief doesn't want to talk to you and doesn't trust you, then one of the things you need to do is say, excuse me, sir, I have X number of readers. My job is to get this information. Your job is to serve the public, and you do that through me. And I'm going to stay here until I get what I need from you. So you can't let yourself be bullied. You can't let yourself, it's a negotiated dance. I often think of working with official sources as a dance. You use leverage when you need to. If a public official, government official, business person isn't giving you information that you want, you've got to provide the reason for them to give you that information. And sometimes if you have information from somebody else, you leverage it. You got to be careful about not painting yourself into a corner where you're going to get into trouble. But there's nothing wrong with having a little negotiation that says, okay, I'll put this off the record today, but I'm going to go call 5 more people, and the minute I get this from somewhere else, I'm coming back to you, and then I expect you to talk to me. I did a story once about, it's not a business story, but I'm hoping it'll be relevant. It was during, it was in the height of a lot of the controversy over AIDS and gay rights in the U.S. So it was like late 80s, early 90s. And in Minnesota, the church is a big deal. Lutheran church, Catholic church. And there was a story that came over the wire services one day that said a very popular Catholic priest at the church, the Catholic church at a college campus, university campus, had announced that he was being dismissed from his job. So what? Well, college campuses all have church presences. The Catholic Church has something called a Newman Center on college campuses, public campuses around the university. It's a very big deal. And this guy, this priest, was very, very popular. He had brought a bunch of people back to the church because a lot of people my generation left the church. And he had built up all kinds of programs in the community for kids who were homeless, kids who were on drugs, disabled people, people who were unemployed. So he was doing a lot of community service work, and he was fired. I grew up Catholic. I didn't know a priest could be fired. I learned. So it was a big story, and part of the reason it was a huge story was because one of the reasons he was fired, the stated reason, was because he had written an article for the local church newspaper that challenged the Catholic Church's position on gay rights and its treatment of homosexuals. So his bishop fires him. So I go up, and there's 35, 40 reporters at a press conference that he's going to hold. And, of course, what everybody wants to know is why this priest took this position, because he had to know it was going to get him in trouble, right? The Catholic Church is very strict, anti-gay, even though it's all a big lie within the church. The recent Pope actually talked about the gay culture in the Vatican, which was really interesting. So everybody wants to know if this priest is gay, and if he's got basically a personal motive for this position. Well, the priest isn't talking. So I'm at the press conference, a bunch of other people at the press conference. He just talks about his position on, his philosophy about the church needs to embrace everyone. And everybody's trying to figure out what he's about. And, of course, he's not going to say, oh, by the way, I'm gay. So everybody goes off to, there was a parallel demonstration because all the supporters were showing up outside the bishop's office to demonstrate, to try to get him reinstated. They all go off, and I stay at the rectory, the offices where he gave his speech, and I try to get to talk to him. Of course, he's back in an office. He won't talk to me. Now, he's this guy at this point that I want to talk to, right? He won't talk to me. So instead, I stay at his office, and I talk to everybody else in his office and say, could you help me get to Father Dorn? His name was Bill Dorn. They said, no, we don't know you. So I'd give them my card, and I'd say, look, here's my card. Why don't you, check out my work? You can call anybody you want about me. I've done a lot of work with the church down in St. Paul. I've done a lot of work with the gay community on this issue. Check me out. And please give this to the priest. Everybody, 5 people. Help me out. And then I wrote a note to him saying, if you need to call anybody about me, I really want to talk to you. What are you concerned about? Please call. And I put it under his door. And I left. Then I go to the demonstration. I write about the demonstration. Big deal. Front page news. 2,000 people show up and say they want this priest back. And because the church is a big deal there, and because of the time and the climate, it was a big story. He wouldn't talk. So I call him up the next day. I'd really like to talk to you. He says, no, I'm not going to talk to you. I know what you want, and I'm not going to talk to you. And I'd say, okay, but I'm going to be doing some stories about this, and I think eventually you're probably going to want to talk to me. I'm not going to talk to you. Okay, so I said, okay, but I'm going to call you again tomorrow. And meanwhile, I'm calling other people. Brokers. You want to use brokers to get to people. So I'm calling other people in the gay community, saying this guy took a courageous stance. Do you know him? Can you talk to him for me? I'm calling other priests I know in the church. I'm saying, you know my work. Would you call him for me? And they're like, you got to stay away from this one. So what I started doing, I wanted this story. I wanted to know who this guy was and what his motivation was. I started doing other stories. So I thought, I didn't know a priest could get fired. I've got a huge Catholic population that reads the paper. What if I write about the employment rights of a priest in the church? How does the church work? It's an explanatory piece. We went through all those layers of stories. So I thought, I'm going to write about what legal rights the priest has. If I get fired from my job, because I'm gay, I'm not, but if I do, that's discrimination. It's against the law. Well, does he have the same rights? So I call a few people, and I realize I can do a really interesting story about the legal ramifications of an action within the church and whether or not people in the church have the same rights as private citizens, right? So I have an excuse to call the priest back. Father Dorn, I'm doing a story on the legal maneuverings of the church. Would you like to talk about it? I'm not talking to you. Okay, shoot. So then I do that story, and then I think, He was fired for something he put in the newspaper, the church newspaper. Who runs the church newspaper? The bishop who fired him runs the church newspaper. He's technically the publisher. Didn't he know this guy was going to put this? How many people read the church newspaper? I look around and I realize the church newspaper in Minnesota is the largest in the country. It's huge. That's kind of a big deal. So I say, I'm going to do a story about the church press. What an interest. It's a business story, right? The church has its own press. So I call the priest back. Father Dorn, I'm doing a story about the church press. Would you talk to me about it? I'm not talking to you, Jacqui. Sorry, shit. So I write that story, right? And then I do a story about, well, okay, this guy gets fired. He's a Catholic priest. He gets fired for saying something about homosexuality. Catholic Church is not big and keen on homosexuals, yet the Catholic Church was the first one to do AIDS hospices in the United States. That's kind of interesting. I'm going to do a story on how the Catholic Church is both kind of the best and the worst in this era. Father Dorn, I'm doing a story about the Catholic Church and AIDS. You want to talk to me? I'm not talking to you. Okay, but I do the story. Then I get interested in other churches and how they deal with homosexuality. So then I put together a huge Sunday package about how the Protestants, the Catholics, the Jews, the evangelicals, where they all stand on homosexuality and AIDS. Great story. Issues piece, those different layers. Hey, Father Dorn, I'm doing a story about, not talking to you. So then finally, I said, So we got a priest who was raised in the Catholic Church, educated by the Catholics, and the bishop who fired him, but they were both brought up in the same system. Why does one feel exactly the opposite of the other? And both are quoting theology. So I decided to do a story about theology. Who writes about theology, right? But I'm like, how do you end up with the same theological beliefs and come to two different positions? It's an interesting story, right? How did two people grow up in the same household and one become politically very conservative and the other politically very liberal? Happens in every house. Do any of you have siblings who completely disagree with you on political things? I have a brother who's very conservative. We grew up in exactly the same household. And we look at each other and say, where'd you come from, right? Where'd you come from, you idiot? So I'm thinking this is pretty interesting. So I call the priest up and I say, Father Bill, I'm doing this story about theology. And he said, you're going to write about theology? And I said, yeah. And he says, who reads about theology? I said, I'll put sex in the first two paragraphs and I'll have everybody hooked. Now he's interested because I'm now going to write about something he cares about. He has a very, very deep, deep theological belief. So now he wants to talk. And he says, but I know what you want to talk about, and I'm not talking about it. And I said, but will you talk to me about theology? And I promise you, all we'll talk about is theology. We'll talk about what theology you were taught, why, where you find this position in your theological beliefs. And he's like, So I finally found his motivational button, right? And one of the things you have to do with sources is figure out where their motivation is.